Henry VIII's reign was characterized by two obsessions. The first was with blood, and the second was with power. It was during those final winter days of 1547 that England's most renowned king confronted his own mortality with the same cold calculation that had led him to slaughter two wives and countless foes. His body lay swollen and decaying from the inside out. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, "The lion is dying," but his claws stayed sharp until the very end of his life. Decades back, there was a handsome and athletic prince who was famous throughout Europe for his vigor and charisma. This prince was the beginning of the road that led to this absurd conclusion. At what point did this brilliant boy from the Renaissance morph into the terrible tyrant who was gasping for air in the chambers of Whitehall Palace that were lit by candlelight? Not only does the solution lie in his notorious marriages, but it also resides in a string of medical misfortunes that would cause his body and mind to be twisted beyond recognition. Henry was hardly recognizable as the man who had previously engaged in combat with the most renowned knights in Christendom by the time January 1547 rolled around to him. His body had become a battleground of ailments, and his legs were afflicted with ulcers that were suppurating and emitting a stench that was so offensive that courtiers had a hard time not throwing up when they were in his presence. It was now necessary for the monarch to make use of mechanical gear in order to move his huge mass, which, according to some reports, had grown to encompass about 400 pounds. His eyes had now sunken profoundly into skin that had taken on a sickly yellow tinge, and his face, which had once been attractive, had become deformed and bloated. The small arsenal of treatments that the royal physicians had available had been depleted. Bloodletting, herbal mixtures, and prayers were all ineffective against the concoction of maladies that were afflicting their sovereign. The majority of contemporary historians are of the opinion that Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, which is a painful bone infection that would explain the leg pain that he had on a consistent basis. It was more concerning that the king's mental state had deteriorated. His notoriously explosive temper had become more erratic, with periods of muddled lethargy mixed with these bursts of explosive wrath. Despite this, the politics of succession continued to occupy the royal court, even as death stood close at hand. Jane Seymour, the king's third wife, had at long last given birth to a male heir, Edward, who was only 9 years old and suffered from a severe illness. By the time Henry passed away, however, strong forces had already begun to position themselves to exert control over the boy. There was a competition between the reformist Protestants led by Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle, and the Orthodox Catholic group, which was led by the Duke of Norfolk. Henry, who was paranoid until the very end, was fully aware of these plots, and he signed execution orders despite the fact that he had significant difficulty holding a pen. The rapidly deteriorating health of the monarch continued to be one of the secrets that was guarded with the utmost care throughout the realm. Meanwhile, royal proclamations continued to portray Henry as healthy and robust, despite the fact that the truth revealed a quite different picture. The individuals who were granted access to the royal sick room were confronted with a gruesome picture. The room had an enormous royal bed that was wrapped in dark textiles, the sickly sweet scent of decay that was barely masked by burning incense. And at the center of the room was the mountainous form of a man who had once personified the vitality of England itself. Cranmer made certain that it was only the most vital attendants who were allowed entrance, and that every one of them was pledged to complete quiet regarding the monarch's condition. This was done to prevent any power grabs or even foreign invasions. Even Queen Catherine Parr, who was Henry's sixth and only surviving wife, was kept at a remove throughout some crucial times of time. As the month of January progressed into February, the monarch experienced a fluctuating state of consciousness. During the limited intervals of lucidity that Henry had, it was said that he expressed mounting anxiety over his coming judgment before God. With an increasing sense of dread, the man who had slain 2 wives, innumerable lords, and thousands of common citizens was now confronted with his own mortality of his own making. According to the diary of one of the attendants, the king was heard mumbling prayers and requesting forgiveness while he was sleeping. This was a striking contrast to the unyielding dictator who had transformed England's religious landscape through pure force of will. The extreme precautions that were taken to preserve Henry's residual dignity during these dying days were disclosed when the court papers were examined. As an increasing number of bodily functions failed, teams of servants labored in turns to manage the increasingly unpleasant responsibilities of cleaning and transferring the large royal corpse. According to reports, the ulcers that were present on his legs had become so serious that bone could be seen through the necrotic tissue present. When the king lost consciousness, the stink became so overpowering that perfumed handkerchiefs were essential accessories for anyone entering the royal chamber. Additionally, windows would be flung open despite the winter cold while the king was unconscious. By the 27th of February, even the elaborate charade that the king would recover could no longer be maintained within the circles of the court. As Henry's breathing became increasingly difficult, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to the royal bedside in an urgent manner. According to contemporary reports, the king, who was unable to speak, was urged to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he placed his faith in Christ rather than in the religious procedures that he had previously treasured. There is a sad anecdote that is frequently mentioned by Protestant historians as evidence of a deathbed conversion. Henry is said to have squeezed all his remaining strength before slipping into his final coma. On the morning of January 28, 1547, the monarch passed away before daylight. Henry's massive physical presence continued to dominate the royal room even after he had passed away, to the point that his corpse was a horrific monument to excess and pain. However, contemporary medical study reveals that the cause of death was a fatal mix of heart failure, sepsis from infected wounds, and complications from suspected type 2 diabetes. The official cause of death was simply recorded as natural decay. There was a stunning conspiracy of silence that followed the death, which was even more astonishing than the death itself. The Privy Council hid the news for 3 whole days while they were consolidating authority around young Edward VI. This delay proved to be important in securing a seamless transition of power. Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford and the new king's uncle, acted with brutal efficiency to seize control of the situation while Henry's body was cooling in his chamber. It was decided to hold secret meetings, in addition to securing key fortresses and eliminating prospective competitors. There was a public declaration of Henry's dying on January 31st, which was also the day that the bells of London finally tolled to signify the passing of the monarch. Edward Seymour had previously been presented with the titles of Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, which practically gave him the authority to rule England in his nephew's name. The process of disposing of Henry's bones provided a number of one-of-a-kind obstacles that shed light on the funeral rituals of the Tudor age, as well as the physical condition of the monarch at the time of his death. According to the documents filed with the court, the royal corpse started degrading at an alarmingly rapid rate, most likely as a result of the advanced diseases that were already present. Embalmers labored tirelessly to prepare the body by extracting internal organs and filled the cavities with aromatic herbs and preservatives. They also extracted the organs from a body. According to reports, even these specialists were taken aback by the condition of Henry's internal organs, particularly his enlarged heart and liver that were both suffering from sickness. It is said that Henry's coffin, which was allegedly about twice as wide as a typical noble's casket, required special construction in order to accommodate his huge girth. Because of the weight, a reinforced bier and additional bearers were required in order to move the item. During the time when the body was lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses stated that the lead-lined coffin actually broke under the strain of the gases that were building up inside the body as it decomposed, causing fluids to leak out onto the floor of the chapel. Despite the fact that this gruesome detail was hastily covered up, sources claim that the hounds licked at the seepage, which created a cruel final indignity for a king who was enamored with majesty. The Tudor authority had one more opportunity to demonstrate Henry's power, even after he had passed away, and that opportunity came on February 16th, when a funeral procession was held at Windsor Castle. Along with effigies depicting the king in his heyday, rather than the bloated figure he had become, black-draped horses brought the enormous casket through streets packed with mourners. The streets were crowded with mourners. Henry was put to rest next to Jane Seymour at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Jane Seymour was the only wife who had given him a son and heir, and she was also the only wife who had been spared the experience of falling from royal favor by dying of complications during childbirth before Henry's affections could wane. Henry's affections for Jane Seymour continued to grow throughout his life. The physical reality of Henry's corpse, which was in the process of decomposing, stood in stark contrast to the myth-making that was already taking place regarding his authority. The image of Henry as the broad-shouldered personification of masculine authority, with legs firmly planted, fists on hips, and a defiant glare at the observer was sculpted by court painters such as Hans Holbein. This image has endured for centuries. Despite the fact that this skillfully produced propaganda bore little similarity to the disease-ravaged body that was now sealed beneath the stone floor of Windsor, it would become the ultimate picture of Henry VIII in the common imagination for years to come. All of Henry's last-ditch efforts to exert influence over the future from beyond the dead were disclosed in his testament. The 30-page paper lay out the succession in a very detailed manner, beginning with Edward, then moving on to Mary, who was the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and lastly ending with Elizabeth, who was Anne Boleyn's daughter. This distinct line of succession would finally be followed, despite the fact that it was disrupted by the reign of Lady Jane Grey for a period of 9 days. It was exactly as Henry had stipulated that the king's posthumous grip on England would endure through all 3 of his offspring, each of whom would rule as Tudor kings until the dynasty was eventually brought to an end with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. The power arrangements that Henry constructed for Edward's minority were more immediately significant than anything else. In order to govern collectively until Edward attained the age of 18, the monarch established a regency council consisting of 16 separate individuals. The fact that Henry was not willing to allow any one lord to have an excessive amount of influence over his son was reflected in this balanced approach. The careful planning that he had done, however, was rapidly undone when Edward Seymour outwitted his fellow advisors and became the Lord Protector within a few days of Henry's passing. The quickness with which Henry's requests were disregarded highlighted the limitations of even a king's power. Even after death did away with his terrifying presence, the medical impact of Henry's final days continues to fascinate historians as well as medical professionals. Despite the fact that his symptoms have been retrospectively classified as indications of a wide range of conditions, including syphilis and scurvy, the most persuasive evidence is that he is suffering from type 2 diabetes that is worsened by chronic osteomyelitis. From the application of live pigeons that have been sliced in half and placed on his festering wounds to the use of experimental concoctions of gold and pulverized precious stones, the medical records of the king depict progressively extreme remedies. Not only do these costly but ineffective treatments demonstrate the limitations of Tudor medicine, but they also demonstrate the extraordinary steps that were taken for a patient of Henry's standing. The personal things that were discovered in the king's chambers after his death were perhaps the most moving of all the items. Among the typical accoutrements of royal power, such as jeweled daggers, official seals, and diplomatic correspondence, servants found a small locked chest that contained more personal items. These included a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair that was thought to have been from his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book that may have been Elizabeth's before her mother was executed. Despite the fact that his body and intellect were deteriorating, Henry maintained some connection to familial relationships and personal sentiment, as evidenced by these humanizing elements, which offer a peek of the guy who was behind the horrific reputation. After the death of the king, rapid political realignments were initiated, which would have a lasting impact on England's future for decades to come. Edward Seymour's establishment of a distinctly Protestant regency resulted in the sudden marginalization of conservative Catholic factions that had maintained their power during the final years of Henry's reign. Archbishop Cranmer, who had performed the final rituals for the monarch who was nearing the end of his life, was now accelerating the religious reforms that Henry had approached with greater caution. Only 2 years after Henry's death, the first English Book of Common Prayer would be released, which would push England far further toward the doctrine of Protestantism than the monarch himself had ever intended. The ambiguous legacy that Henry left behind, which allowed both Catholics and Protestants to flourish, was the result of his complicated religious attitude, which included breaking with Rome, but still keeping many Catholic rituals. Various factions asserted that he was their own. Catholics appealed to his support of transubstantiation and resistance to Lutheran theology, while Protestant reformers stressed his rejection of papal power. They also emphasized his opposition to Lutheran theory. As England swung between severe Protestantism under Edward, Catholic restoration under Mary, and finally the moderate way created by Elizabeth, this theological uncertainty would fuel religious tensions during the reigns of all three of his children. Elizabeth would eventually establish the intermediate way. Additionally, the death of the king is considered to be a significant turning point in Tudor propaganda. After having built the image of Henry as England's defender against foreign threats and papal tyranny, royal publicists were now faced with the difficulty of transmitting this power to a kid who was only 9 years old. The photographs of infant Edward VI were purposefully designed to resemble his father's trademark stance. These paintings depicted the youngster with the same wide-legged posture and defiant face that had been characteristic of Henry's most renowned images. The court rites placed an emphasis on continuity, and it was essential of the courtiers that they kneel down before Edward's empty throne with the same devotion that they had shown to his father. In addition to the realm of politics, the death of Henry echoed through the everyday lives of people all around England. During the course of nearly 40 years, he had become the personification of royal authority, with his personality and whims directly influencing governance all the way down to the municipality level. A psychological void was created as a result of his passing, in addition to a political deficit. There was a widespread fear of the future, as evidenced by the increased number of reports of prophetic dreams, weird celestial omens, and even accusations of ghost sightings, according to parish record from the beginning of the year 1547. It was inevitable that the passing of such a powerful ruler would carry with it apocalyptic connotations for a society that was completely immersed in religious iconography. The complicated position that England currently held on the European arena was brought to light by the reactions of the international community to Henry's passing. It was claimed by the French ambassador that King Francis II of France was very saddened by the passing of his beloved brother of England. Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, conducted a more realistic analysis of the strategic ramifications, wondering whether England, which was ruled by a child monarch, may be susceptible to invasion or alliance. This was in spite of the fact that they had repeatedly fought each other. It was stated that Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry 10 years previously, offered a mass for the soul of the king. This was a diplomatic gesture that acknowledged Henry's value while simultaneously reasserting the Catholic claim on his spiritual destiny. Henry's private chambers in Whitehall Palace, the location where he passed away, became imbued with historical significance almost immediately after his death. Courtiers said that they were reluctant to enter the quarters where the monarch had endured his final agonies. The reports of unusual sounds and chilly patches that could not be explained fueled the superstitious fears that were prevalent at the time. Reportedly, young Edward VI turned down the opportunity to lie in his father's bed and instead insisted that fresh rooms be made for him. Henry's death had a painful impact on those who had observed his decline, many of whom had committed their lives to anticipating and gratifying his unpredictable needs. This psychological aftermath represents the traumatic impact that Henry's death had on those individuals. It is one of the most well-documented royal deaths in history, and a medical case of Henry provides excellent insights on the medical practices that were prevalent during the Tudor period. Because they were maintained as evidence that every possible effort had been made to save the king, his physicians have kept detailed records of the therapies that were delivered to him during his final months. These documents have survived because they were preserved. Hot cupping to pull out foul humors, herbal concoctions based on classical books, and even early kinds of hydrotherapy are some of the procedures that are revealed in these documents, which demonstrate an approach that combines ancient Galenic medicine with rising Renaissance techniques. In light of the fact that these treatments were not successful in providing relief, it is clear that even the most skilled medical practitioners of the day were constrained by certain restrictions. In addition to his preoccupation with his posthumous image, the king gave specific orders for the construction of his tomb, which was to be a gigantic structure that would dwarf all other royal burial sites in England. Henry commissioned complex designs that included 40 bronze figurines that were life-sized and a towering center structure that was crowned with a statue of himself on a horse. This extravagant idea was a manifestation of both his ego and his fear for the way in which history would evaluate him. It is ironic that the big project was never completed because of budgetary constraints. Furthermore, the bronze statues that were supposed to be created were finally melted down during the English Civil War, which is a scenario that would have incensed the king who was concerned with his appearance. In the early wake of Henry's passing, there was a rush to either seize the opportunity to protect his legacy or to remove oneself from it. In the closing years of his life, courtiers who had fallen out of favor emerged from hiding, while others who had benefited from his patronage tried to establish new protective alliances. During the course of their decades of dedication to the king's personal requirements, royal attendants unexpectedly found themselves without positions, and the archives contain heartfelt communication from those individuals. For many, adaptation proved to be impossible. The skills necessary to manage Henry's violent temperament had little relevance at the more controlled court of Edward VI. Some erstwhile favorites committed suicide in the months following the death of the king because they were unable to navigate the quick power transfers. Henry's death marked the beginning of a momentous movement in English administration. This transition was from rule by an absolute monarch whose personal will-dominated policy to more collaborative forms of power sharing between the crown and the aristocracy. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this transformation was that it occurred when Henry died. In his role as Lord Protector, Edward Seymour did not possess the terrifying personal authority that Henry possessed and instead relied more primarily on the consent of the council. It is important to note that although this change was briefly reversed during Mary's reign, it did establish precedents for the constraint of royal power. These precedents would evolve further under Elizabeth's reign and ultimately contribute to the distinctive constitutional evolution of England. It is therefore paradoxical that Henry's death brought about a weakening of the same institution of absolute monarchy that he had spent his entire life working to promote. The terminal illness of the monarch became a subject of considerable medical retrospection, with each successive generation of physicians reinterpreting his symptoms in accordance with the current understanding of the field. Understanding that Victorian physicians were affected by moral ideas on sickness, they stressed syphilis as a potential cause, and they viewed Henry's condition as divine retribution for his sexual excesses with regard to his sexual behavior. In the early 20th century, experts made a greater emphasis on metabolic problems, indicating that diabetes and gout were the chief causes of the condition. Modern medical historians have hypothesized more complex diagnoses, such as mold syndrome, which is a rare hereditary illness that would explain both his physical degeneration and psychological alterations, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which would be the result of repeated jousting injuries sustained by him when he was younger. The disposition of Henry's personal belongings offers an interesting peek into the views that Tudors had regarding death and the act of remembering the deceased. The court inventories provide evidence that the objects that the king touched during his final days were accorded a special level of devotion. Some of these objects were even maintained as quasi-relics, despite the fact that the official Protestant establishment disapproved of such activities. Under Cranmer's direction, his last set of night clothes, which were stained with human fluids, were burned in a ceremony. This was an act that combined the practical necessity of hygiene with the symbolic importance of the significance. Additionally, more costly things, like as his enormous collection of astronomy equipment and maps, were meticulously catalogued before being either donated in accordance with his will or kept for Edward's educational purposes. As a result of Henry's passing, his surviving wives and children found themselves in hazardous situations, which required them to navigate court politics with caution. He left behind a widow named Catherine Parr, who maintained a dignified public mourning while quietly moving with extraordinary speed to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour, a match that she had postponed during Henry's lifetime. 9-year-old Edward, now king in name, but heavily controlled by his Seymour uncles, recorded his father's death with disturbing detachment in his journal. The emperor's ambassador was commanded to come home on the 4th of January upon the death of the king. My father, whose soul got pardoned, the formal, unemotional entry suggests the limited personal relationship between father and son. Henry's daughters, on the other hand, were confronted with their own difficulties under the new government. Mary, who was 31 years old at the time, continued to be a devout Catholic despite Edward's efforts to reform the Protestant religion. It was necessary for Elizabeth, who was only 13 years old at the time, to negotiate the court system with extreme caution because her position was made vulnerable by the execution of her mother and the ongoing suspicions regarding her validity. Mary narrowly avoided execution during Wyatt's insurrection, while Elizabeth endured captivity in the Tower throughout her sister's reign. Both of these princesses would eventually succeed to the crown that Henry had promised them, but the route before them would prove to be perilous. The reports of Henry's dying hours provide light on the incredible sense of solitude that even the most powerful monarch may endure at the moment of his death. In spite of the fact that he was surrounded by medical professionals, attendants, and courtiers, contemporary accounts indicate that Henry met his death in a state of essential loneliness. He was isolated from other people due to the fact that he was a king and the fact that death itself was a particularly personal experience. According to reports, Rammer's attempt to find spiritual solace was met with no response beyond the final hand squeeze given to him. In the end, the king, who had been able to command complete obedience throughout his realm, found himself traveling beyond by himself. The year that followed Henry's death revealed how firmly his personality had controlled English politics. This was a heartbreaking reminder of the immense leveling effect that mortality possesses. Administrative records reveal a backlog of decisions that had been waiting for his personal attention. These decisions included a number of matters that were of concern and could have been resolved by subordinates. Yet, due to a culture of great deference, these concerns were elevated to the level of royal decision-making. When Edward was in charge of the administration, it was necessary to reorganize the procedures so that they could be carried out without the direct participation of the king. Despite the fact that this transition was initially chaotic, it ultimately resulted in the strengthening of institutional governance by resulting in the development of bureaucratic mechanisms that were able to function independently of the personal attention of the monarch. Henry's final appearance in England's public theater of power was portrayed by the magnificent funeral procession that occurred during his death. In contemporary sources, horses are described as being wrapped in black velvet, heralds are described as carrying ceremonial weapons, and a wax figure of the king in full regalia is described as being placed atop his coffin. The wax effigy is said to be life-sized, and it is said to be replacing the natural body that was disguised beneath it. Through the course of many days, this procession made its way from London to Windsor, providing thousands of subjects with the opportunity to witness this final demonstration of Tudor glory. The meticulous choreography conveyed a profound sense of unease at the political transition, and the use of ritual served to emphasize the notion that even if the king might pass away, the monarchy would continue to exist. In the aftermath, the future of court physicians who had been unsuccessful in their attempts to save the king were uncertain. There are medical records that demonstrate that some individuals were able to rapidly secure posts with other noble families, while others were subjected to professional ostracism as a result of their involvement with Henry's unsuccessful treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had the bravery to notify Henry of his approaching death when others did not have the courage to do so, capitalized on this demonstration of courage to continue serving the royal family under Edward VI. During Henry's terminal illness, the apothecaries of the king were subjected to a heightened level of scrutiny, with inventory of medicines that were delivered being checked for the possibility of incompetence or, even more seriously, purposeful hastening of death. In the 1800s, when the vault was being renovated, a scientific study of Henry's remains was carried out. This analysis revealed tantalizing insights regarding the physical condition that Henry was in when he passed away. A gigantic skeleton that was compatible with Henry's recognized stature was discovered by the workers. The skeleton showed signs of significant joint degradation, notably in the legs. Based on the application of contemporary forensic techniques to ancient medical records, it is possible that Henry had achieved an unusual weight of roughly 400 pounds at the time of his death, with a waist measurement that was greater than 50 inches. This excessive obesity, in conjunction with the poor circulation in his legs and the open wounds that were reported in ancient sources, would have produced ideal conditions for the sepsis that most certainly contributed to his death. The things that Henry's dying days disclose to us about the boundaries of power are maybe the most illuminating aspects of his life. The king, who had made significant changes to the religious landscape of England, carried out the execution of queens and nobles without fear of repercussions, and constructed a navy that would eventually dominate the waters of the world, found himself completely powerless in the face of the degradation of his body. According to the archives of the court, there were instances in which Henry became enraged against his physicians and demanded that they restore his health via the use of royal authority alone. This fruitless defiance against the biological truth reveals the primary contradiction of absolute monarchy, which is the inevitability of the vulnerability of even the most robust human body to disease, degradation, and death. Because of the religious ambiguity that surrounded Henry's death, there was room for competing narratives that served a variety of political goals. In contrast to Catholic writers outside of England, Protestant chroniclers emphasized moments of evangelical clarity that occurred on the king's deathbed, while Catholic writers depicted a ruler who was racked by regret for his rupture with Rome. In point of fact, there is evidence that implies Henry retained his typical theological viewpoint till the very end. He accepted himself as the supreme head of the English Church while rejecting crucial Protestant tenets. This complicated theological stance, which was fundamentally Catholic in formality but rejected papal authority, was a reflection of the king's long-standing desire to construct institutions around his own personal wants rather than conforming to external standards. The devastating effects of Henry's passing on the economy were felt far beyond the confines of the court. The new Regency government inherited a critically depleted treasury and a debased currency, according to the financial records. This was the result of Henry's expensive wars in other countries and his wasteful personal expenditures. The construction of palaces alone during Henry's reign is said to have cost $200 million, according to some estimations. As a result of this financial crisis, Edward Seymour was compelled to continue Henry's unpopular policy of selling monastic holdings, which sped up one of the most significant changes of property ownership in the history of England. The ripples of Henry's extravagant spending would have a significant impact on the economy, leading to inflation and social unrest during his children's reigns respectively. Henry's physical deterioration served as a compelling metaphor for contemporary onlookers, many of whom considered the king's body as emblematic of the nation itself. Henry's decline had a significant impact on history. At the same time that medieval political thought had portrayed the king as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers viewed Henry's deteriorating flesh as a symbol of more widespread corruption across the realm. It is clear from sermons that have survived from the year 1547 that preachers were drawing explicit analogies between the sick legs of the king and the perceived moral decay in English society. Throughout Edward's reign, reformers argued that just as Henry's body had required radical intervention, so too did England's religious practices need to be purified. This symbolic reading gained political significance throughout Edward's reign. When Henry VIII was nearing the end of his reign, a unique period occurred in which medieval and early modern ideas of kingship came into conflict with one another. On the one hand, there are the elaborate funeral rites that are preoccupied with the correctness of burial and the anxiety of succession. The death of Shaun matched centuries-old trends of royal deaths that had been seen earlier. On the other hand, the meticulous medical records, the legal rigor of Henry's testament, and the institutional continuity of administration were all examples of more contemporary approaches to the authority of the state. As a result, Henry died at a time that was simultaneously spanning two eras. He was the last English king to exercise authority that was really medieval, and he was also a ruler who had pioneered the bureaucratic state infrastructure that would characterize future governance. It is not merely the horrible physical details or the political significance of Henry VIII's death that make it so riveting. Rather, it is what it reveals about the human condition itself that makes it so compelling. For the final moments of his life, the king who had ruled his time period through pure force of personality was forced to meet the same restrictions that even the most modest of his followers were forced to face. Henry, who was facing judgment not as a king, but merely as a man, is said to have had moments of existential fear in his final days, according to contemporary reports. It is said that the Archbishop of Canterbury reminded him while he was administering his last rites, "You are about to appear where no titles bear weight and no earthly power offers protection." In that final human vulnerability, perhaps England's most notorious king was able to establish a connection with his subjects that he had been unable to achieve throughout his reign.